heard from the west to the east. I worked in my craft and I prayed for my time on the scene. The man have never left my team. 19, learned the right creed. Nah, I'm not a right breed, but I might be. In my crease, Nikes, hit up my G. I'll still never sell out my theme. Well, you know about heritage. You go inherited. Don't chill with the sticks.
Hey friends, hey, welcome to a new episode of Common Sense Pod. Thank you so much for listening to this. If you haven't done so, do hit the subscribe button or the follow button wherever you are watching or listening to this. It really helps the podcast. Now, I didn't acknowledge this last week, but the song you heard coming in is called Yar by Samson, who's a friend of mine. And you can always check out his music if you go into the description section of this podcast or on YouTube. Now, this episode is about Ukraine and Russia. And, I really searched hard before I made this episode because I did ask myself, is there a need for my voice? Do I need to add to the already 24/7 news cycle on this issue? You got RT and Russian-owned media going into overdrive trying to spin this. You've got the Western narrative. You've got conspiracy theorists going mad. I'm just thinking, do I need to add to this, right? What can I possibly add? And after speaking to friends, I decided for this episode, I wouldn't get a guest on because I don't want to have another discussion about what's going on. I want to just give you crystal clear information, give you a sense of all the different, moving parts and perspectives to consider as you seek out information for yourself. Times like this are super important that you seek out impartial, bipartisan, but also, information that doesn't have an interest, so to speak. And so I'll try my hardest to do that. But it's also very important to put it on the table right now. When you've got a fast developing story like this, information and fact very quickly becomes out of date. So I'm recording this podcast Monday, the 20th of February. I've left it as late as possible, 6:53 p.m. And so, by the time you're listening to this, if you're listening to it back after a while, some of the facts may be out of date, right? But also, I don't just want to just give you news stories because then the replay value of this is very low. You can only really listen to it once. Instead, I want to try to get a bit deeper into some of the motivations and, like I said, perspectives for you to consider as to why this may be happening, but also why democracies are so fragile and why it's very, very important for us in the West here to be very active in watching Russia's actions. Now, I'll give you some summary points just in terms of where we are right now, whilst you're listening to me. Chances are this may be out of date when you're listening, but as of today, air raid sirens were heard in Ukraine's capital city, Kiev. And the reports are there's been a Russian airstrike on the outskirts of the city. This means the Russian army is moving away from the second largest city, and now they're moving towards the capital city. Now, dozens of civilians were killed earlier in Ukraine's second largest cities, Kharkiv, I believe. This is what the interior minister said. Now, negotiators from Kiev, Ukraine's capital city, and Moscow held talks earlier today in Belarus. And essentially what they're trying to do here is negotiate a ceasefire or basically try and bring an end to the conflict. Now, Russia says both sides have committed to continue talking and will meet again in the next few days. Now, Ukraine's leader, Zelensky, urged Russians to lay down their weapons and called for the EU to immediately fast in, if you like, the accession process and bring Ukraine into membership of the EU. Now, FIFA and UEFA, they've suspended Russian football clubs and national teams from all competitions. And the UN says more than 500,000 refugees have now fled Ukraine into neighboring countries. So that gives you, a snapshot of what's currently happening there right now. Now, in typical Western form, I took to Instagram to ask a couple of people what's going on, to ask a couple of people what they want to know about the conflict, because I just want to answer questions that people who listen to this podcast may have. So if you want to be part of these kind of episodes in the future, then you need to be following myself or Common Sense Pod or the Common Sense Network online. That way you can see these questions. So if you don't follow us, it's Common Sense Podcast on Instagram, CS Pod, CS Podcast, and I'm Mike Omni, and you can just find us online. Now, the first question here was essentially, I'm showing my age, I gotta get my glasses out, was what are Putin's motivations? Now, I put some notes down here, but I have to first put it on the table that I can't read a man's mind, so I have no clue what's in his soul. But there are a couple of motivations that we can think about, right? That may explain Russia's aggression, or the Kremlin's aggression particularly. Now, the Cold War is what people always talk about. Following 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union. Russia, if you like, became a diminished power on the world stage. They lost a bunch of land because former Soviet countries broke away. When we think about Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, to name a few, Estonia, so on and so forth. Now, Putin's always been bitter since the Cold War ended because essentially it saw a shrinking down of his country, and the West pretty much declared victory. So one of the motivations, some may say, is this is consistent with Putin's desire to slowly rebuild Russia's sphere of influence, right? To pull different countries into Russia's orbit and to basically almost try to reset the time and grow Russia's power again. That wouldn't be too hard to imagine a former Soviet super state trying to kind of flex its muscles and grow back to what it once was. Now, some people will say Russia's justified in trying to grow power because America has become more and more increasingly powerful since the end of the Cold War, but also NATO has also become more and more powerful, and NATO's actually starting to accept more and more countries that are on Russia's boundary. Now, for that reason, folks would say that this is Russia trying to basically grow its power base out again. There's a second motivation I can think about, which is more, I guess, about this kind of ideological messianic belief that Russia has, or that Putin has. And this is that Ukraine belongs to Russia. There's parts of Ukraine where Russia's spoken. In fact, certain eastern parts of Ukraine, Putin's decided are actually Russia, right? Belong to Russia. And so anytime that Ukraine tries to kind of align itself with the West, it really rubs Putin up the wrong way, because he believes that fundamentally Ukraine isn't a real country and really belongs to Russia, right? So Ukrainian conquest, if you like, is justifiable because really it's just a younger brother of Russia, and it's always belonged to Russia. Now, the third reason I can think about is, of course, that Putin detests the West. I think this is patently clear. I've said it on other shows, news shows and podcasts, that Putin hates how the West works, the democratic leadership style, the uncoordinatedness, the free press, all these crucial features of Western democracy Putin has never liked. He thinks diplomacy, if you like, it's kind of the West's tool, and it's how they're going to perpetuate their lies. In an earlier press conference, we saw him calling the West an empire of lies. Now, those may be some of these motivations, but there's a more particular and a more technical one, which is that Putin fears that Ukraine may join a larger body like NATO or the EU, and therefore become insulated, if you like, from aggression. If you're a member of NATO, there's an article called Article 5, which essentially means that an attack on one member of NATO means an attack on all members of NATO. Now, Ukraine, that shares its border with Russia, if Ukraine was to join NATO, if anyone aggresses Ukraine, then NATO would have to defend that country from the aggressor, if you like. And if two members of NATO are in a fight, then whoever's the aggressor would be kicked out of NATO, and then the whole of NATO would then basically defend the country still a member of NATO against the aggressor. So Putin's fear is, as NATO continues to expand, if Ukraine should join NATO, then that threatens, if you like, the sovereignty or the power or the economic structure of Russia. And so he's never liked that. Ukraine's been saying it wants to do that. And so with all these other reasons, Putin just decided, I would rather just take over Ukraine now. So I hope that gives a good answer to some of what these motivations might be. Second question reads, who does Putin think he is? All right. I don't know. But I did say something in another podcast, which is that Putin's been president or prime minister of Ukraine, of Russia now, for 22 years. And it was the second ever leader the country's had after Yeltsin. When you've been in power for that long, you do develop this kind of larger than life sense of living. You're like Teflon, nothing sticks to you. You can do anything you like. And so in all of Putin's calculation, he just believes he can do this. And knowing that other countries won't actually put troops on the ground, Russia, that has the second biggest army in the world, just decided that this was a fight worth going in for. It's one that sits with them ideologically. It makes tactical sense for them to do. And also they believe they can do it because, he believes that the Ukraine belongs to him ultimately. So that might give you a sense of why that's happening. The third question reads, is this a new Cold War? Is this the Cold War Mark II? Now, I think it's probably early to make those kind of calls when we think about the degree of the Cold War. But I don't think it's too crazy to imagine that instead of communism, the ideological battle lines this time are with democracies and autocracies, I guess. And you can look, if you look at on the world stage, that the autocracies kind of loosely align, if you like, to form a coalition where the political regimes they have share that same common characteristics. Centralized leadership, people in the middle that basically function as dictators, but put on a front of democracy. So you can look at Russia and think about other communist countries like China or North Korea, or even theocracies when you think about Iran. All of those could function as a block, where then you look at the wider West and their democracies functioning, together. And yes, you could see cooperation between these autocracies when you think about economic cooperation. You think about military assistance. They might give each other diplomatic backing. They might work together militarily. So I do think it's early for that call, but it's not too hard to imagine that something like that could be how we see the new world order, so to speak, is a alignment of all the Western democracies against these more traditional, if you like, autocracies who have a certain belief pattern. Now, the next question says, is the West to blame? Is the West to blame? Well, listen, being from the UK, we have a habit of blaming everything on us, really, and the UK is responsible for a lot of things around the world. The West at large does have to share a portion of blame in one part, and that is, we've always believed that Russia, or the new Russia, when Putin emerged into the world stage, was this willing to do business, pragmatic new Russia. And so we've turned a blind eye to many egregious offenses that Russia has committed, like annexing Crimea in 2014. And we kind of just let it go in favor of doing business with Russia. We've allowed our economies to become so intertwined and so interdependent that Russia knows that even the sanctions that his country would suffer would be limited, in that the UK and other countries couldn't hurt Russia without also hurting themselves. So we've been treating Russia like a liberal democracy, and not recognizing the autocratic leadership that it has. And of course, there's times where we've seen the West condemning Russia. They often do it. But because we've treated them as that, and we've allowed our economies to become so independent, we are at fault for letting things get to this stage and letting things blow up like this. NATO is also to blame, because NATO was formed at the end of World War II, and it was formed for a very specific reason. It's pretty much expired now, but still, the NATO continues to operate around the world and carry out all sorts of different activities. There's lots of betrayal on both sides, but I think, the West does definitely share a part of to blame. Now, this seems like a statement here, but I will explore some of these things. Someone said, have you seen the way they treat black people it's a shame to see racism even in times of conflict. Yeah, so I saw some videos, and I'll show you, if you're listening to this podcast, you'll have to pay close attention, but I will show you some of the videos I've seen around how black people are being treated, especially black people in Ukraine trying to flee the country, get on the trains to neighboring countries. And here are two interviews of statesmen or politicians sharing their thoughts on what's going on. I'm going to play some of them for you now.
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion. What you are outlining there is this tension between longer-term efforts to apply pressure to Vladimir Putin, such as financial sanctions, and the very immediate military threat which you're experiencing.
Now, that was very disappointing to hear. And I actually watched this interview live and was so fascinated by what was going on with the war that I actually didn't catch it, because you have to listen closely. He said it's really sad to see. And he said it was sad to see European people with blonde hair and blue eyes, which is very odd. That's a reference to that Aryan race that Hitler once spoke about. It's a very narrow way to see what it means to be European. I mean, what is he talking about there? Is he saying that people who don't have blonde hair and blue eyes aren't European? Now, let's assume he's under stress and he didn't know what he was saying. It's still a very odd thing to mention that particular definition of European. Now, there's a saying I heard growing up that when you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice, right? And I guess in times of conflict, when you squeeze some Europeans, it seems as though you get racism. I don't think it's excusable. I think it's sad. And for me, it's really quite telling that in moments of conflict, people are almost saying what they mean. And what they seem to mean is that Europe, and in particular Ukraine, belongs to blonde-haired and blue-eyed people. That's ridiculous. That's a view that should not be aired in public at this stage, but also to come from a politician and a statesman who should be better at these sort of interviews was really, really sad to hear. I found those views pretty abhorrent, actually. Here's another interview that shared a different view.
Population. And as you're talking to us, Matthew, we're playing in the latest pictures of some of the refugees trying to get on trains or trying to get out of Ukraine. And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
I don't even know where to begin with this one because, it's the language is dressed up so as to be descriptive, but of course it's just nonsense. The notion that these aren't obvious refugees because they're middle class, it's such coded language and quite frankly dog whistle that it just makes me think, what on earth is this person even talking about? Why are these views being aired? This notion that these middle-class, well-dressed people don't deserve something like this. Of course they don't, right? But they don't deserve it because they're humans, and no human deserves it. Not because they're middle-class and well-dressed and European, right? There's conflict happening around the world right now in Palestine, in Somalia, in Yemen. There's conflict everywhere. But the idea that it's the middle-class people who are well-dressed that deserve our attention and our care, it's really sad, and I hate doing this, right? When you've got conflict going on, I hate going, but there's conflict happening here as well, because it feels like you're doing the whole, what about, but it's true. What about other places in the world where conflict's happening? Let's not focus on this conflict solely because it's white people. I mean, let's put it out there. Right, that's a problem, and I have an issue with that narrative. Any persecuted people deserve our care. Any persecuted people deserve our support. We shouldn't use these, blonde-haired and blue-eyed kind of dog whistle. So that was really, really sad to see. Now, the last question, which I'll consider, is what do you think will happen next? Someone asked, what do you think will happen next? Well, listen, I don't know. On a podcast, I spoke about how this has already had massive ramifications. We've seen gas prices shoot up. We've seen the price of the barrel of oil go up. I've said it before that Ukraine is responsible for 8% of grains, the grain supply worldwide. So it's going to have an effect on a lot of different things. There's been lots of sanctions, and the EU keeps announcing multiple rounds of sanctions that are starting to tighten their grip on Russia. So we'll see. I mean, this invasion has taken a lot longer than Russia planned for. We were told this would take a couple of days, and now we're seeing it's taken almost 7 days at this stage. And Russia won't want to capitulate and say, we failed, invading a much smaller country militarily, and also a much less developed country militarily. That would be embarrassing on the world stage. And if Putin's reputation is anything to go by, he's not simply going to abandon his imperialist ambitions. But at the same time, President Zelensky is leading a very, very inspired group of Ukrainians. And these aren't just all soldiers. These are, I mean, it seems like everyone really is staying in that city to fight. And the motivation that you have to fight and die for your country is very different to the motivation you have to just fulfill your duty or to basically further the aims of an imperialist kind of dictator. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because both sides just don't seem willing to lay down arms at this stage, or at least will want the other party to go first. We'll, of course, keep covering it at the Common Sense Network. We'll keep writing articles about it. But I hope this was helpful and served as a good information source. If it did, please do hit the subscribe button or follow button. We want to grow this podcast. If you're listening on the Apple Podcast, then do leave a review and give us 5 stars if possible. And of course, what's really important to me is that you share this with a friend. Share this with someone you love. Give them tell them to give the podcast a go. We've got some exciting guests booked. I mean, we've got like, I think 10 or 11 guests back to back booked. So I'm very excited for this season. But I will need your help growing this podcast. So if you are a kind of continual listener, thank you so much. And if it's your first time, do subscribe and be a part of this growing family. Stay safe and have an amazing week.
Wanna be heard from the west to the east. I worked in my craft and I prayed for my time on the scene. The man have never left my team. 19, learned the right creed. Nah, I'm not a right breed, but I might be. In my crease, 9 kids, hit up my G. I'll still never sell out my theme. Well, you know about heritage, you go inherited. Don't chill with the snakes.